Hello there, my friends. Chris Marcus here for another episode of Inside the Markets, and excited to have a guest on that I've been listening to and being blown away for in the past couple months. That is Alex Newman, a foreign correspondent for the New American, who has been digging into all the things happening politically and financially and can help make sense of it. So, Alex, thanks so much for joining me today. It's great to have you on the show. How is everything going with you, my friend?
I can't complain. Thank you so much for having me on, Chris. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, well, to dig in, just to get started, I've been confused. I think a lot of other people as well, where we hear Trump when he was campaigning, stock market's a bubble, mentions auditing the Fed, gold standard. A lot of things that have happened since he's gotten into office have played out differently. So just to start off, any thoughts on what is going on and help break this down for folks who are confused by the two sides? And I get the feeling, especially from your content, it's a lot different than what we're being presented with.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, on the campaign trail, Trump was saying some things that were just, shocking for somebody coming from my perspective who recognizes that the Federal Reserve has been artificially manipulating the stock market and messing around with interest rates in a way that governments and central banks have no business doing. Juicing the markets here, overheating them there, cooling them down here. That's all central planning. So to hear a presidential candidate talk about how the Federal Reserve had created, I think he called it a very fake economy. I was like, no way. Did he really just say that? They're never going to let him get away with that. And somehow he won, right? And he had talked about how the gold standard would be such a better system. Vice President Mike Pence has talked about the same thing. So this was very unusual rhetoric, to put it mildly, coming from a presidential candidate, much less one who would actually go on to win the election. I mean, Ron Paul talked about these things, and the media tried to basically crucify him over it or ignore him, but they couldn't do that with Trump. So I get the feeling, from knowing people who were very, very highly involved in his campaign at senior levels, from people who've been advising him for years, for decades, I get the feeling that Trump not only understands how the Federal Reserve works and how there's this agenda to kind of move us toward a more globalized world with increasing globalization and more political power migrating from states to nations and from nations to regional governments and ultimately global governance is what they call it. Trump understands this all, and I don't think he supports it. In fact, when he was talking about Hillary Clinton working with a cabal of international bankers to build a global government, he was telling the truth, right? And he vowed to put an end to that. He said, "We're gonna uphold Americanism. We're gonna crush globalism." So I think the media likes to act like this is all just some random chaos and Trump has no idea what he's doing. I think he's being very strategic in terms of what policies he pursues, what issues he focuses on in trying to derail the globalist agenda. So I have some concerns right now about this USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, in that it is the very essence of the globalism that Trump has opposed. But he may be doing a smart move here too. I just read recently he was going to actually cancel NAFTA and then see what happens from there. So maybe we'll end up canceling NAFTA. The USMCA will go down in flames, and we'll end up back with regular trade before we had NAFTA. So I think Trump understands what he's doing. I hope he does. All the evidence that I've seen suggests that he does, and in my opinion, this is a very good thing.
So is he actually playing this chess game where, like you said, he does understand it? Again, we saw those promises before, and then when I saw Goldman Sachs come in as his cabinet, Steve Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary. Now, on one hand, if Trump's choosing that, would not make me feel comfortable, although maybe there's a degree to which Trump actually picks the people who are in there. And just fascinating now how, again, he's saying the one thing publicly, but sounds like you're saying he actually does understand this is a bubble, does understand that all this credit has been built up, and so maybe doesn't actually believe when he's saying that now the stock market's roaring and everything is okay?
I had the same concerns as you when he started putting nominees into his cabinet. Steve Mnuchin, I think, is a really good example of exactly this problem. And I mean, this guy's beyond just Goldman Sachs. He's a member of the Skull and Bones Secret Society, for example, at Yale, that both George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, John Kerry, all these leading insiders have been members of. So I was very concerned about that. But there are also some very good people in his cabinet too. And I think the way to understand that is, at some point, all of these nominees for cabinet positions have to go through the Senate. There's only so much that an establishment Republican like Mitch McConnell will allow to happen. Yeah, his wife got a cabinet position, right, running the transportation department. Of course, his wife is another shady character. But Trump was able to get some very good people in place. And ultimately, the president sets policy, not his appointees. And if an appointee doesn't want to implement the policies that President Trump is asking for, we know what happens now, right? We saw that with Rex Tillerson. Rex Tillerson went out there, quietly, but undermining what President Trump was trying to do. Oh, yeah, President Trump says those things, but really, we're still globalists. We'll continue funding your thing. And Trump just said, fine, you're fired. He told him on Twitter. Right. So I think the message has gone out to the cabinet that, you only have so much free reign before the "you're fired" card comes out. And as for the economy, I think Trump understands much better than he lets on. And again, we can go back to his campaign statements when he explained very clearly that the Federal Reserve had juiced the economy, had created a bubble by having interest rates too low. I mean, he said all that openly and publicly. The media didn't report much about it, but it was out there. And so he clearly understood it back then. The idea that he suddenly forgot what he understood a year and a half ago doesn't make sense to me. So I think he has a very good understanding of what happened. And I think the analogy of a chess game is a very good one because even on things where I was like, I can't believe he just did that. The war in Syria comes to mind. The globalists, the establishment, have wanted a war in Syria for so long. Trump said all along, no, we're not going to do a war on Syria. Leave Syria alone. That's a bad idea. And then suddenly he started lobbing a few missiles over there. And CNN said, oh, he looks so presidential. And all the neocons and the globalists were just thrilled. And then it was just a missile on an empty airfield. Nothing happened. And so I was all upset with Trump. How did you do that? You betrayed us. And then nothing happened. So I think he's smarter than a lot of his opponents. And I think we're seeing that more and more. So.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that, although since you mentioned Syria, something I've been wondering for years that I think you're the perfect person to ask. I think it was back in 2013 when Obama was still there and we heard Syria use chemical weapons. Somehow they had ironclad evidence of that before the weapons inspectors went in, they claimed. I've never seen that, and it seems almost like every 2 years, it's like they're dusting off the old playbook, say, all right, we'll accuse Syria of using chemical weapons. I'm not clear if anyone has ever seen the evidence they claim they have. I've heard folks like yourself and others that know the situation far better than I do that claim the idea that Assad would do that would be politically asinine. Do you feel there's any truth to that, or is this just another deep state, let's get them riled up, see where we can cause trouble, and it's not based on anything?
I'm 100% convinced that what's been going on in Syria, these alleged chemical attacks by the Assad regime, I think they're 100% false flag attacks. And I think the evidence is overwhelming showing that's the case. Now, the first one and the second one, and I think they may try to do it again. And, the media keeps trying to push it. And people are waking up. You had one of the UN's weapon inspectors come out and say, no, that was obviously the rebels. It was a false flag attack. You've had a lot of people come out and say that. And the evidence, I think, at this point is overwhelming. And on Syria, the establishment has lost all credibility. Back in 2011, 2012, we at the New American were reporting what was really happening in Libya and Syria, that this was a jihad backed by the establishment in the West, by globalists, by the Council on Foreign Relations. And that was kind of laughed out of the room by respectable opinion. Then a few years later, you had Joe Biden admitting that in a speech at Harvard, saying, oh, yeah, well, they were Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Sorry about that. Now we have the smoking gun documents. Right now we have an actual document from the Defense Intelligence Agency admitting that the U.S. government and its allies supported the Syrian opposition, that the Syrian opposition was led by Al-Qaeda in Iraq and by the Muslim Brotherhood. This eventually became ISIS, and that one of their goals was to create they called it a Salafist principality, fundamentalist Islamic principality, a small state in eastern Syria. So now we have smoking gun evidence, and this is, again, something that President Trump has talked about. When he said this on the campaign trail, his exact words were, Obama and Hillary are co-founders of ISIS. The media just laughed. They actually laughed out loud. And Trump let him do it for a couple of days, and then he put out the document, right, showing that Actually, Hillary Clinton had read a document from the highest levels of the intelligence agencies showing that we knew this was Al-Qaeda, that we knew this was the Muslim Brotherhood, and that we knew the goal was a independent Islamic state in eastern Syria, and that we supported it all along. So, this is another example where the establishment is using lies and deception against our own interests to move forward their agendas. And it's another example of Trump speaking out on this very deception and exposing it. So it's it's a fascinating time to be alive to see all this. I didn't think I would see it in my lifetime. So
yeah, and I remember that well when he said it, because I like to think I was a little awakened by then, and it reminded me even of going back even further. We heard about how Osama bin Laden was this boogeyman, yet nobody ever seems to mention, with the exception of folks like you, that the Bushes and bin Ladens were business partners up until the late 90s. So the idea that some of these things are coming from the U.S. really isn't all that far-fetched, is it?
I think that's exactly right. And, we interestingly had Hillary Clinton admitting in sworn testimony in Congress that, oops, yeah, we kind of did create Al-Qaeda. Yeah, we really did fund those guys in Afghanistan. Maybe that wasn't the best idea. And so you have this absurd situation where we're squandering trillions of dollars on an alleged war on terror. And all the while we have smoking gun documents from the U.S. government proving that they are supporting the very same people they claim to be fighting. In Libya, we were reporting this long before the bombings actually started, that these so-called rebels were actual Al-Qaeda people, right? The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which the U.S. military identified in 2007 as Al-Qaeda, was leading the rebellion against Gaddafi, who up until that time had been a U.S. ally in the terror war. Then the same thing in Syria all over again. And the same thing before that had happened in Afghanistan. Then, with Iraq, we've helped put Saddam Hussein in power. Then we needed to go remove him. So you have this. It would almost be funny if the consequences weren't so tragic in terms of the loss of life and the squandering of American treasure. It's unbelievable that we're funding and creating enemies for ourselves. It's just, at some point we have to say, the definition of treason is aiding and abetting enemies in a time of war. If we're really waging a terror war, which of course Congress has never declared, then isn't it treason to aid and abet the terrorists who we're supposedly fighting? And if it is, why do we have people who have admitted on national television that they've been doing this, running around? It doesn't make any sense. And I did see just a couple of days ago, Trump tweeted out an interesting thing asking when the treason trials were going to begin on people like Obama and Hillary and Attorney General Eric Holder and some of these others. So hopefully there's something to that.
Yeah, which it's beyond fascinating. And Alex, you mentioned earlier how even within these organizations, I remember when I started reading about the Fed, assumed they were all bad. Although I've heard from several different folks the narrative that there are good folks within each of these. And maybe I'll summarize this to a degree here, but essentially in the way that as Americans, I grew up, Russia was the bad man. We had Rocky IV, Cold War, all these things training you. If you see any guy who looks Russian, he's naturally the enemy. While at the same time, the U.S. going into the Middle East saying we're liberating people from the dictators. Where now with some of these narratives that are coming out, I hear folks that are good researchers that I respect essentially say that in the same way we thought we were going to the Middle East to liberate from the dictators, that Trump may actually be working in conjunction with Xi Jinping, with Vladimir Putin, to tear down this banking matrix, and that he knows, trade war is not ideal. He knows what's going to happen with the interest rates, yet really, is it that these groups are liberating us from the dictator, which is the banking matrix or New World Order or whatever you call it, and they know that the only way that could be done is by crashing the system so that we can rebuild something new, which on one hand, as I first heard it, is insanely wild. On the other hand, what we're hearing publicly doesn't fit and make sense. So you're the perfect person to get a comment on that one on, and curious what you think.
It's a good question. And, I think there is a sense among some parts of the establishment that they would love to use a crash that they engineered to bring about, the next step forward in the evolution of what they're trying to build, which would be, going straight to a global currency, if not, a regional currency, saying, the dollar is no longer the world reserve currency. Oops, that was dumb. Why did we ever trust America to do that. We need to now move toward, regional currencies. And ultimately they have, they've expressed this publicly on many occasions, a desire to create a world currency. It would be created by the IMF. In fact, a proto-global currency already exists. It's called the special. And I think there is very real risk that the powers that be, if you will, might try to undermine the U.S. dollar and undermine the U.S. economy for the purpose, maybe this SDR, if we don't move first toward a regional currency unit. Now, as far as Xi and Putin, my sense of Xi and Putin is that they are both involved in the effort to shackle the planet under a new world order in a different way, maybe than the Western globalists, the Western elites. And I've written 2 articles about this subject that I would encourage people to go look up because, I think this is an incredibly important question. It's going to become only more important as time goes on here. I know there's a lot of people in the United States and around the world who look to Putin as this kind of enemy of the New World Order, who maybe is trying to destroy the architecture of it and save Western civilization or whatever. And I think if you look at the issue superficially, you could come to that conclusion. But when you really dig deep into Putin, you see, I can give you a couple examples. First of all, he is very close to Henry Kissinger. This is one of the lead architects of what he himself calls a New World Order. They have dinner at each other's houses, right? How many people eat dinner with Putin at his house? Not many. Right. And Putin is also following the playbook very well. If you notice, we have this pattern all over the world. In every region of the globe, governments are surrendering sovereignty to regional governments. The European Union obviously is the premier example, but in Africa, they have the African Union that has its own military and its own parliament. They put Robert Mugabe, the mass murdering Marxist former dictator of Zimbabwe, was made the chairman of the African Union for a while. So that gives you some clue about what kind of organization this is. Yep. In South America, you have the Union of South American States. In North America, they were trying to use NAFTA as a springboard. Kissinger called it the most creative step toward a new world order since the end of the Cold War, and he said that in the Washington Post. Of course, you have in Southeast Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. In the Gulf, you have the Gulf Cooperation Council. And then Putin is building this Eurasian Union. And so if you look at the plan to build this global governance, Putin fits in very nicely. And in fact, he's given public speeches where he talks about eventually merging his Eurasian Union with the European Union and creating this vast area from Portugal to the other end of Russia in a free trade area, which is one of the terms they like to use to implement this subversion of sovereignty. And then, so I wrote an article about that. It's called Putin and playing a key role in the New World Order. And then when it comes to communist China, now this I think is huge. And I think everybody who's trying to understand and make sense of what's happening in the world needs to understand this. And I encourage people to go read an article I did about this. It was a cover story. And I may have even been too conservative when I wrote this in terms of, estimating their influence and their importance in this. It was called China Staking Claim in the New World Order. And I just started off by quoting globalists. You have people like George Soros saying that China needs to own the New World Order, was how he put it, just like the United States owned the Old World Order. You have David Rockefeller, who went over there back in the 1970s and came back and wrote in the New York Times that the social experiment under Chairman Mao was the most important and successful in all of human history. And today you have the communist Chinese penetrating the leadership of all these international organizations, including the United Nations, including Interpol, right? They literally had the presidency of Interpol until, the guy was disappeared when he went back to China quickly. I don't know what all that was about, but interesting theories floated. So I think the way to understand communist China is that it is serving a crucial role in the move toward this new world order. And in fact, I think China is almost like the model that they want to use, this technocratic rule where basically citizens are totally controlled. Now they have this Orwellian social credit system where every citizen is going to be ranked based on, what they post on social media, who their friends are, and if your rank is not good, you may end up in a prison camp. You can't leave the country. You can't get a job. So those are my views on that. And I think Trump has a good understanding of the threat that China poses. The fact that he appointed Navarro as his advisor on this issue, to me, suggests that Trump really understands what the deal is with China. I mean, it's at the point now where we can't keep a lot of our own Air Force jets in the sky without Chinese parts.
Yeah.
That's not sustainable, especially when you have top generals in the Chinese Communist Party bragging about how one day they're going to nuke hundreds of American cities if we, for example, were to fulfill our obligations, our treaty obligations with Taiwan. That's crazy that we would depend on them to be able to keep our military equipment running. So I think Trump does have a good understanding of that. And, with this G20 alleged softening of the tensions, I'm still trying to make sense of that and see what the deal is. I know the news that just came out shortly before we started recording this. So we'll see what's happening there. But I think Trump does understand this, and I think it's a good thing, because if there's three issues that I would say are existential threats to the security, the prosperity, and the liberty of the American people, it would be communist China and its expansion, the globalism coming through the United Nations and its affiliated institutions. And of course, I think all three of these work together in the submergence of the United States as a free and independent republic into this architecture that they're trying to build. And so to me, it seems like Trump is focusing like a laser on each of these issues. And I'm encouraged to see that, actually.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's just stunning, the things that are happening. And I'm curious how you see this affecting the financial markets. Obviously, we have petro-yuans. We have here today, Russia is trying to tell India, good time to make arrangements to do things outside of the dollar. I've wondered if the U.S. tried to force conflict with China that owns all those treasuries. I know a lot of people say, well, they don't want to sell the treasuries because they're going to take a loss on that, which is true. Yet my perspective is that the money's gone, and if someone puts a gun to your head, and you dump a big load of treasuries, they do have the option to end the paper money financing system at any point in time. And of course, when you look at any of the numbers, the U.S. is clearly unsustainable. Is this heading towards a reset, a default? Are they just going to print? Obviously, a lot of people have turned to gold and silver and are a little confused. So curious how you see the financial implications.
I think if the establishment, if the deep state, so to speak, gets its way, I think what we're going to see at some point is a massive destruction of the U.S. economy in terms of the value of the dollar, in terms of our stock market, in terms of and the reality is that a lot of our productive capacity has now been shipped to China. A lot of our technology has now been shipped to China. A lot of our military capability has now been shipped to China. Some of it was sent over there by Bill Clinton in exchange for illegal campaign contributions. And this all came out, right? Johnny Chung was actually talking about this. So we have a situation now where the globalists have engineered the rise of communist China and the gradual decline of the United States. And, whether it will come in spectacular fashion, like a implosion of the dollar, a sell-off of treasuries by the communist Chinese, I think that's a very real possibility. It may be a more gradual and orderly decline, but I think the vision that the globalists have, you hear them talking about it often now. I'm actually on my way right now to Katowice in Poland for the UN Global Warming Summit that started today. Goes for another 2 weeks, so I'll be there. And one of the terms you hear all the time when you go to these globalist summits run by the United Nations is that we're moving into a multipolar world order. And so I think the way to understand this, they call the world order that we've been living in unipolar, right? With the United States as the sole remaining superpower after the end of the Cold War. Well, there's a lot more to it than that, right? Even what happened in the Soviet Union after the ostensible collapse is not exactly what we've been told. But what's happening now is the globalists the deep state has used America for what they needed to use it for, right? To build these institutions of global governance, to give the United Nations teeth, to create this architecture with the World Trade Organization and the Interpols and the United Nations and the World Bank and the IMF. And now, as the American people wake up to what's happening, this power is gradually being spread out around the world. Right? And this is happening still to this day, right? We're giving China more control over the World Bank. And now the World Bank is helping them to work on their One Belt, One Road system, which is basically like all roads lead to Beijing type scheme. We see they're now getting more voting rights in the IMF, right? And Obama tried to set this off and very successfully. So what's happening now is the former superpower status of the United States is gradually in decline, and the power is now being spread out to all these other powers. And I think that's really bad news for the U.S. economy. And at some point, we have to say it's already kind of baked into the cake, right? You mentioned the numbers are totally unsustainable. There's never been an entity in human history that's in as much debt as the U.S. government. This was deliberately engineered. It's not sustainable. They wasted all the money, right? It's not that they invested in anything useful. They spent it on welfare and blowing things up and studying shrimp on treadmills and, the most asinine things. So now we're in very serious trouble. At some point, the old expression, the chickens are going to come home to roost. Well, they're going to come home to roost, and it's not going to be nice, either to the U.S. dollar. And I know, in 2017, 2018, the dollar was, performed very, very, very well relative. And, again, this was engineered to be this way. I don't think that this was just all idiot policy moves out of Washington, D.C. I think this was a deliberate agenda. But at some point, we're going to have to realize that we're just borrowing money. We have no way of paying it back. We're printing money like it's going out of style. In the last economic crisis, the Special Inspector General for the Troubled Asset Relief Program said they printed like 27, or not printed physically, but created $27 trillion worth of new currency and credit. Who's going to loan money to an entity that's doing that kind of thing? It's just outrageous. And so when that happens, who's left standing? Well, you have communist China, you have the European Union, right? And I think that is ultimately the agenda. And, whether Trump is able to successfully maneuver us out of that situation, I don't see how it can be done, at least not with a lot of pain. And we need to go through a lot of pain. There's so much malinvestment. There's been so much borrowing. We need to work that all through the system. But, they've left Trump and the American people in a very, very bad position. So over the long term, I'm pessimistic about the U.S. economy, unfortunately.
Yeah, and certainly it's hard to see how it goes forward without a crash, although I don't know if this is what I think or what I hope yet. When I think about how the Fed's printed away about 99% of the dollar, I mean, geez, if we were using tulip bulbs at this point, anything outside of that system, I think a lot about how if we're getting 1%, just imagine if the Fed left 10%, every single parent that's working 2 or 3 jobs and really struggling and maybe making $25,000 or $30,000, and they tack a zero on the end of that, which really just putting in perspective how much the Fed and the money printing has affected things. So I appreciate that you're getting information, helping us to understand what's happening so we can get through that. Hopefully there's something better coming on the other side of that. I guess we'll see. Although perhaps, again, maybe you could just let folks know where they could find you. I'll post those 2 articles you mentioned below on the tab so people can read that. And again, just if you can let them know again where they can find you so they can stay up to date and be informed, so that doesn't have to be catastrophe for everybody, but you can plan and prepare for these things.
Awesome. Hey, I really appreciate it, Chris. Thank you. And, I agree with you. It doesn't have to end in catastrophe. It could be that when all this, when the chickens come home to roost, so to speak, that enough Americans are educated about what's happening that we can lean on our elected representatives and have them do some serious work on the monetary system so that we can rebuild on a solid foundation. And that's my hope, and that's what we ought to be working for. I don't think we need to just accept that they're going to loot our economy, rob our children, and then run off into the night like Maurice Strong and go hide out in communist China. So thank you very much for the opportunity to come on. I encourage people to go to thenewamerican.com. You can sign up for our daily headlines there. We have a print magazine, comes out twice a month. So if you're not a subscriber yet, I encourage you to get that. And even if you don't subscribe, you can get the free daily headlines. And if daily's too much for you, you can get the top headlines for the week, and that's all free. So go to thenewamerican.com, and I hope people will stay up to speed there. Check out those articles I offered about Putin and China, and follow us, and we'll keep you up to date on the important political and economic developments. And thank you again, Chris, for having me on.
Yeah, well, thank you, Alex. I know it takes a lot of courage to stand up and speak out about the things that you're doing, yet as the word spreads and enough people actually knew what was going on and started to see some of these things for what they really are, I think it's making a big difference in the world. So grateful for all you've done, and thanks again for joining me today, and we'll look forward to checking in with you again soon.
Hey, thanks so much, Chris.